The rattlesnake's warning came too late for Beatrice Keller to react, as she stood frozen among the tall prairie grass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild mustang desperate to break free. Montana Territory, 1875, a place where nature showed no mercy to those who failed to heed its warnings. Beatrice had been gathering wildflowers in the meadow when the distinctive rattle pierced the summer air. She'd turned, her dark blonde hair whipping across her face, just in time to see the diamondback strike, its fangs sinking deep into her calf. The pain was immediate and sharp, like two hot pokers driven through her flesh. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew no one would hear. Utica, Montana was miles away, and she'd foolishly ventured out alone. Her pa's warnings about the dangers of the frontier echoed in her mind as she stumbled and collapsed, clutching her leg as fire seemed to spread through her veins. Miles away, Zachary Dawson rode his chestnut stallion along the ridge overlooking Judith Basin. At 26, he'd spent nearly half his life as a cowhand, the last 3 years working cattle for the Rocking M Ranch outside Utica. His weathered Stetson shaded piercing blue eyes that missed little, and today they caught something unusual, a splash of blue fabric against the golden grass far below. Something made him rein in his horse. Through squinted eyes, he studied the scene, noticing the blue wasn't moving right. A moment later, he heard what might have been a scream carried on the wind. "Come on, Thunder," he urged his mount, turning down the slope at a dangerous pace. His instincts rarely led him wrong, and right now they were screaming that someone was in trouble. Beatrice's vision blurred as she tried to stand, only to collapse again. The venom worked quickly. Her leg had already swollen to twice its normal size, an angry red surrounding 2 distinct puncture wounds. She ripped a strip from her petticoat and tied it above the bite, remembering something her father had told her about slowing the spread of poison. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, though panic clawed at her throat. At 22, she'd faced the hardships of frontier life since arriving in Montana 3 years earlier, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her family's homestead was too far, the town even farther. Darkness edged her vision as the poison coursed through her system. The thundering of hooves barely registered until a cloud of dust announced a rider. Through tear-filled eyes, she saw a tall figure dismount in one fluid motion and run toward her. "Miss, what happened?" The man's voice was deep, urgent. "Snake," she managed, pointing weakly at her leg. "Rattler." Zachary knelt beside her, taking in the situation with one glance. He'd seen snake bites before, had even helped treat a fellow cowhand once. Without hesitation, he pulled his knife from its sheath. "This'll hurt," he warned, his voice gentler now. "But I need to make the wound bleed more, get some of that poison out." Beatrice nodded, biting her lip as he carefully made shallow cuts across the punctures. Blood welled up, darker than it should be. "My name's Zachary Dawson," he said, trying to keep her conscious and calm. "I work at the Rocking M. Beatrice Keller," she whispered. "My family's homestead is north of here." Zachary nodded, recognizing the name. The Kellers had a modest spread, decent folk by all accounts. He'd tipped his hat to Mr. Keller in town once or twice, but had never met the daughter. Without another word, Zachary bent down and pressed his mouth to the wound, sucking out the poison and spitting it onto the ground. The bitter taste filled his mouth, but he continued the process several times, pausing only to rinse with water from his canteen. Beatrice watched through a haze of pain and growing admiration. Many men would have hesitated, might have simply carried her for help, but this cowboy was fighting to save her life with a directness that spoke of experience and courage. "Thank you," she murmured as he finally sat back, wiping his mouth on his bandana. "Don't thank me yet," he replied grimly. We need to get you to a doctor. Utica's too far, but you're home. 5 miles northeast, she said, her voice weakening. The venom's effect was intensifying despite his efforts. Zachary made a quick decision. He tore strips from his spare shirt and wrapped her leg firmly, then gathered her in his arms. She felt light, despite her full skirts, and incredibly vulnerable. "I've got you, Miss Keller," he said, lifting her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Just hold on." Beatrice leaned back against his solid chest as he wrapped one arm securely around her waist, the other holding the reins. The pain was excruciating, but the comforting strength of the stranger behind her gave her courage. "Thunder's the fastest horse in the territory," Zachary told her as they set off at a steady pace, careful not to jostle her unnecessarily. "He'll get us there." The journey seemed endless to Beatrice. Every hoofbeat sent waves of agony through her leg, and the venom's spread made her alternately burning hot and deathly cold. Zachary spoke to her constantly, asking questions about her family, her home, anything to keep her mind engaged and her eyes open. "My pa and brothers run cattle," she told him during a moment of clarity. "Ma passed 2 winters ago, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Zachary replied, and she could hear the genuine sentiment in his voice. "My own parents died in a fire back in Kansas when I was 16. Been on my own since." The personal revelation surprised her. Cowboys weren't known for sharing their histories. Something about her vulnerability had perhaps prompted his own. As they crested a rise, Zachary spotted a modest cabin with outbuildings nestled in a protected valley. Smoke rose from the chimney and he could make out figures moving in the yard. "That your place?" he asked, and Beatrice nodded weakly. "Pa," she whispered. "And my brothers James and Daniel." Zachary urged Thunder into a controlled gallop, and as they approached he called out, "Need help." Snakebite. The effect was immediate. 3 men dropped their tasks and ran toward them, faces tight with concern. Beatrice, the oldest man, clearly her father, reached them first as Zachary carefully dismounted with Beatrice in his arms. "What happened?" "Rattlesnake, sir," Zachary explained, carrying her toward the cabin. "About 5 miles southwest. I sucked out what poison I could, but she needs care right away." George Keller's weathered face paled as he took in his daughter's condition, but he nodded sharply and turned to his sons. "James, ride for Doc Miller in Utica. Daniel, get the medicine box and heat water." Zachary carried Beatrice inside the modest cabin and laid her gently on a bed in what appeared to be her room, simple but neat, with a patchwork quilt and dried flowers in a jar by the window. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home," Mr. Keller said, his voice gruff with emotion as he checked Beatrice's leg. "You may have saved her life." "Anyone would have done the same, sir," Zachary replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Many would have been too frightened or disgusted to suck the venom from a stranger's wound. "I'm George Keller," he said, extending his hand, which Zachary shook firmly. "And you are?" "Zachary Dawson. I ride for the Rockingham." Recognition flickered in George's eyes. "Foreman Thatcher speaks highly of you. Says you're the best hand he's got." Before Zachary could respond, Daniel hurried in with supplies, and they turned their attention to Beatrice. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity as they bathed the wound, applied poultices of herbs from Mrs. Keller's carefully preserved stores, and got a tincture of willow bark tea into Beatrice for the pain and fever. Through it all, Zachary stayed, fetching water, holding Beatrice's hand when the pain made her cry out, and telling her father exactly what he'd observed about the snake and the bite. "Wasn't a big one," he explained. "Young diamondback, I reckon. That's in our favor." When James returned with news that the doctor would arrive by morning, some of the tension left the room. Young rattlers, while venomous, rarely delivered enough poison to kill an adult if treated promptly. You should stay the night, George told Zachary as dusk settled over the homestead. It's getting late, and we owe you a proper meal at least. Zachary hesitated, glancing at Beatrice. Her color was better, and she'd fallen into an exhausted sleep after the willow bark tea had taken effect. If you're sure I won't be imposing, he said finally. George clapped him on the shoulder. Son, you carried my daughter 5 miles to safety and likely saved her from losing her leg, if not her life. You'll never impose in this house. That night, after a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread prepared by Daniel, who, Zachary learned, had taken over cooking duties after his mother's death, Zachary sat on the porch with George, smoking and watching the stars emerge. "Tell me about yourself, Dawson," George said after a comfortable silence. "Not many cowboys would have done what you did today." Zachary took a thoughtful draw on his cigarette before answering. "Not much to tell, sir. Orphaned at 16 in Kansas. Worked my way west, learned cattle from some good men. Been with Rockingham for 3 years now. Any family?" "No, sir, just me and Thunder." He smiled slightly, thinking of his loyal horse. George nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, you've made friends today, that's certain. Beatrice is special. After her mother died, she stepped up, kept this place running while still being the gentlest soul you'll ever meet. Teaches at the schoolhouse in Utica 2 days a week, too." Zachary found himself curious about the young woman whose life he'd saved. A teacher with calloused hands and the courage to face a rattlesnake bite without hysterics wasn't the usual frontier woman. "She seems strong," he said simply. "She is that," George agreed. "Too strong sometimes for her own good, stubborn as they come when she believes she's right." His voice held both pride and exasperation. Inside, Beatrice stirred in her fever dreams, the image of intense blue eyes and strong hands returning again and again. The cowboy had saved her, had carried her home as if she weighed nothing. In her delirium, she wondered if he had been real or some fever-induced angel. Morning brought clarity and the arrival of Doc Miller, a gruff but kind man in his 50s, who had served as a field surgeon during the war between the states. He examined Beatrice's leg with experienced hands, nodding in approval at what he found. "Clean work on those cuts," he commented, looking up at Zachary, who stood awkwardly in the doorway. "And the poultice was a good choice, George. The swelling's already down considerably." "Will she recover fully?" George asked anxiously. "Barring infection, yes. She'll need rest for at least 2 weeks, and that leg will be tender for a month or more. But she's young and healthy." The doctor patted Beatrice's hand. "And fortunate that this young man knew what to do." Beatrice, fully conscious now though weak, looked directly at Zachary for the first time since their ordeal began. Her eyes were a clear hazel, intelligent and direct. "I haven't properly thanked you, Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice stronger than he expected. "You saved my life." Zachary shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Just did what needed doing, Miss Keller. Beatrice, please." She smiled, and something in Zachary's chest tightened unexpectedly. "And I think what needed doing could have been ignored by many. I'm grateful it was you who found me." The doctor repacked his bag, gave George instructions for continued care, and left a bottle of laudanum for the pain, though he cautioned Beatrice to use it sparingly. "I've seen too many become dependent on this stuff," he warned. "Willow bark tea when you can stand it." After the doctor left, Zachary knew he should return to the ranch. He had responsibilities, and Thatcher would be wondering where he disappeared to. Yet something made him linger, helping Daniel with morning chores and checking on Thunder, who seemed to have made friends with the Keller's horses. "You're welcome to stay another day," George offered as Zachary finally prepared to leave. "James could ride to Rockingham and explain." "Thank you, sir, but I should report in myself," Zachary replied, though the offer tempted him more than it should. Perhaps I could. Check on Miss Keller's progress in a few days. George's eyes twinkled knowingly. I believe she'd like that very much. Sunday dinner, perhaps. Zachary found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered the implications. He rarely socialized outside the ranch, preferring solitude when not working. Yet the thought of seeing Beatrice again, hearing her voice when not strained with pain, was surprisingly appealing. He said his goodbyes, including a brief one to Beatrice, who was sitting up in bed, a quilt around her shoulders despite the summer warmth. Sunday, she said, holding out her hand, which he took gently. I'll be much better company then, Mr. Dawson. Zachary, he corrected, still holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than strictly proper. And you were fine company even with a snake bite, Miss Beatrice. Her smile followed him as he rode back to the rocking M, puzzling over the strange sense of anticipation that had settled in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in longer than he cared to remember. At the ranch, Foreman Thatcher listened to his explanation with a mixture of concern and amusement. So you finally met a girl who could keep your attention, huh? He teased after Zachary finished his account. It wasn't like that, Zachary protested, though without much conviction. Anyone would have helped, maybe, but not everyone gets invited to Sunday dinner after. Thatcher clapped him on the shoulder. George Keller's a good man, raised those kids right after his wife passed, and if that girl's half as pretty as her mother was, well. He left the thought hanging. Zachary turned away to unsaddle Thunder, grateful the older man couldn't see his face. He hadn't even considered Beatrice's appearance beyond registering that she was young and seemed healthy. Yet now that Thatcher mentioned it, he recalled wide hazel eyes framed by wheat blonde hair, a determined chin, and a mouth that, even twisted in pain, had hinted at a ready smile. The next few days passed slowly for Zachary, filled with the usual ranch work, mending fences, moving cattle to fresh grazing, breaking a new colt, but his thoughts frequently strayed to the Keller homestead and its recovering inhabitant. For Beatrice, the days crawled by in frustrating inactivity. Used to constant movement and responsibility, being confined to bed or chair with her leg elevated tested her patience severely. Her father and brothers did their best, but the absence of a woman's touch in the household had never been more apparent. By Sunday morning, however, she had bullied and cajoled her way into being allowed to sit at the table for dinner. Her leg propped on a stool, but otherwise participating normally in preparing the meal. "You're pushing too hard," James scolded as he watched her peel potatoes, seated at the kitchen table. "I'm going mad with boredom," she retorted. "And I won't have Mr. Dawson thinking we live like savages. This place needs a woman's touch. Is that what this is about?" James raised an eyebrow. Making a good impression on the cowboy, Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Don't be ridiculous. It's about self-respect and hospitality. Pa raised us better than to serve a guest beans from a can." James wisely let the subject drop, but his knowing smile irritated Beatrice all the same. She wasn't fixing herself up for Zachary Dawson. The fact that she'd asked Daniel to fetch her blue dress, the one that matched her eyes, according to her late mother from the trunk, was purely coincidental. When the sound of hoofbeats announced their visitor's arrival, however, Beatrice found herself nervously patting her hair and straightening her collar. Ridiculous, she chided herself. He'd seen her at her absolute worst, covered in dirt and sweat, half delirious from snake venom. A clean dress couldn't possibly make much difference now. Yet, when Zachary stepped through the door, hat in hand and freshly shaven, something in his expression as he saw her suggested that perhaps it did make a difference after all. "Miss Beatrice," he greeted her with a slight nod. "You're looking much recovered." "Thanks to you," she replied, suddenly shy under his direct gaze. "Please sit down. Dinner's nearly ready." The meal was simple but well-prepared: roast chicken, potatoes, early summer vegetables from Beatrice's garden, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed more easily than Zachary had expected, with George recounting tales of his early days in Montana Territory, and James and Daniel good-naturedly arguing about the merits of various breaking techniques for young horses. Zachary found himself relaxing, contributing stories of his own from his years on the range. He noticed how Beatrice listened intently, asking intelligent questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. After the meal, while James and Daniel handled cleanup, George excused himself for his Sunday nap, leaving Zachary and Beatrice alone on the small front porch where she sat in a rocking chair, her injured leg still propped up. "How's the leg feeling?" Zachary asked, settling into a chair beside her. "Better every day," she answered. "Doc Miller says I was fortunate. The swelling's almost gone and there's no sign of infection. He says I might even be able to return to teaching next week, though Papa thinks that's too soon." "Your father mentioned you teach at the schoolhouse in Utica," Zachary said. "You enjoy it?" Beatrice's face lit up. "Very much. There aren't many children yet, just 12 students ranging from 6 to 15, but they're eager to learn. Montana will be a state someday, and these children will need more than just survival skills." Zachary found her passion compelling. "You sound like you've given it a lot of thought." "I have," she admitted. "After Mother died, I could have just focused on keeping house for Father and the boys. Many women would have. But she always said education was the key to a better future, and I believe that's true, especially out here where life is so precarious." He nodded thoughtfully. "Life certainly showed its precarious side to you the other day." "It did," she agreed solemnly. "I've been thinking about that, about how differently things might have ended if you hadn't come along." "But I did," he said simply. "Yes." She studied him with those direct hazel eyes. "Why were you there, Zachary? That meadow is nowhere near the rocking Mtk's usual grazing lands." The question caught him off guard. "I was checking the southern boundary. There have been reports of rustlers in the area, and Thatcher asked me to keep an eye out." Beatrice nodded, accepting his explanation. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm grateful, and curious too. You knew exactly what to do for a snake bite. That's not common knowledge." Zachary was quiet for a moment, memories surfacing. "My father taught me. He was bitten once when I was a boy. A neighbor saved him the same way, cutting and sucking the venom. He made sure I knew what to do if it ever happened again." "He taught you well," Beatrice said softly. "I wish I could thank him." "So do I," Zachary replied, a shadow crossing his face. "The fire that took my parents, it was my fault in a way. I'd left a lantern too close to the hay in the barn. I was 14, old enough to know better." The confession surprised him as much as it clearly did Beatrice. He hadn't spoken of this to anyone in years, certainly not to a woman he barely knew. "I'm so sorry," she said, reaching to touch his hand briefly. "But accidents happen, Zachary. Especially on farms and ranches where there are so many ways for things to go wrong." "That's what my uncle said when he took me in afterward," Zachary acknowledged. "Still doesn't make it easier." "Is that why you became a cowboy, to get away from the memories?" Her insight was unexpected but accurate. "Partly, and partly because it was the only skill I had. My uncle was a good man, but his farm was small and he had sons of his own. When I turned 16, it seemed best for everyone if I made my own way." Beatrice considered this. "And have you?" "Made your own way, I mean. I suppose I have," he said thoughtfully. "I've been with good outfits, saved some money. Thatcher says I might make foreman someday when he retires." "But is that what you want?" she persisted. To work someone else's land forever? The question hit close to something he'd been pondering lately. At 26, he was reaching an age where many cowboys started looking for more permanent situations, their own small spreads, or at least more settled positions. "I've thought about a place of my own," he admitted. "There's good land opening up north of here, but it takes capital to start a ranch, and while I've saved, it's not enough yet." "It's a worthy goal," Beatrice said approvingly. "Montana needs men who care about the land, not just what they can take from it quickly." Their conversation continued as the afternoon waned, touching on books they'd read. Zachary surprised her with his knowledge of Dickens and Twain, acquired during long winter evenings in bunkhouses. Their views on the rapid changes coming to the territory, and stories of their respective childhoods. When George emerged from his nap, he found them still deep in conversation, and the knowing look he exchanged with his sons went unnoticed by either Zachary or Beatrice. As evening approached, Zachary reluctantly rose to leave. "I should head back before dark," he said, though the thought of returning to the lonely bunkhouse held less appeal than usual. "Will you come again?" Beatrice asked, then quickly added, "Father and the boys enjoyed your company." Zachary caught the slight flush on her cheeks. "And did you, Miss Beatrice?" Her eyes met his steadily. "I did, very much." "Then yes, I'd like to come again. Perhaps next Sunday." The pattern was established that easily. Each Sunday, Zachary rode to the Keller homestead for dinner and stayed through the afternoon, sometimes helping with small repairs or projects, but always finding time to talk with Beatrice. As summer progressed, her leg healed completely, leaving only 2 small scars as reminders of their dramatic first meeting. She returned to her teaching duties, riding to Utica twice weekly, and Zachary found himself timing his trips to town to coincide with her schedule whenever possible. In Utica, they'd meet at the general store or sometimes share a meal at the small hotel dining room, drawing curious glances from townspeople who had known Beatrice since her family's arrival 3 years earlier, but viewed Zachary as something of an enigma, a quiet cowhand who kept to himself. "People are talking," Beatrice mentioned one afternoon in late August as they walked from the schoolhouse to the general store. "Mrs. Peterson asked if we were courting officially yet." Zachary glanced sideways at her, noting the slight tension in her shoulders. "And what did you tell her?" "That our arrangement was our own business," she replied with a small smile, which only confirmed her suspicions, "I'm afraid." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Would it bother you if people thought we were courting?" Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "No, would it bother you?" The directness of her question matched his own, one of the things he'd come to appreciate most about her over the past 2 months. No games, no coyness, just honest communication. "Not at all," he said quietly. "In fact, I've been thinking we should make it official, if you're amenable, that is." A smile spread across her face, lighting her eyes. "I'm very amenable, Zachary Dawson." He took her hand then, there on the main street of Utica with half the town probably watching through windows, and raised it to his lips in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and entirely right. "Then consider this my formal declaration of intent, Miss Keller. I'd like to court you properly, with your father's blessing." Her laughter was bright and joyful. "I think his blessing was given the moment you carried me home that day. But yes, we'll do this properly." That evening, Zachary rode to the Keller homestead unannounced for the first time, formally requesting permission from George to court Beatrice. The older man's handshake was firm, his approval evident in the warmth of his welcome. "You've already proven your character, son," he told Zachary. "And I've seen how you look at my daughter. Just don't rush her, she's independent-minded, and she'll need to come to things in her own time." "I understand, sir," Zachary replied, though privately he thought Beatrice's mind seemed quite made up already, judging by the kiss she'd given him before he left town that afternoon, her first. She'd shyly admitted, and all the sweeter for it. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in gold and russet, Zachary and Beatrice's courtship blossomed. They rode together on Sundays after church, picnicked along Judith River, and spent evenings on the Kellers' porch talking about everything and nothing while her father and brothers tactfully occupied themselves elsewhere. In October, Zachary broached the subject that had been growing in his mind since their first serious conversation. "I've been saving," he told her as they sat by the creek, watching fallen leaves spiral downstream, "and looking at land. There's a parcel north of Utica, about 160 acres with good water and grazing." Beatrice's eyes widened. "You're thinking of homesteading," he nodded. "Thatcher's been helping me plan. Says I know enough now to start my own place. It wouldn't be much at first, just a cabin and a small herd, but it could grow." "It sounds wonderful," she said earnestly. "Your own land, your own decisions. Is it very expensive?" "The government price for homestead land is fair enough," he explained. "The challenge is having enough savings to build, buy stock, and survive until the ranch turns profitable. I've been putting aside wages for 3 years now, and I'm nearly there." Beatrice hesitated, then asked, "And where does this leave us, Zachary? Your plans, I mean." He took her hand, his expression serious. "That depends entirely on you, Beatrice. I'd planned to secure the land first, build at least a decent cabin before presuming anything." "Asking what?" she pressed, her heart quickening. Zachary took a deep breath. "This isn't how I imagined doing this. I don't even have a ring yet. But Beatrice Keller, if I build that ranch, would you consider sharing it with me? As my wife?" Joy surged through her, bright and overwhelming. "Yes," she said immediately, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I would." "But Zachary, I don't need a finished ranch to marry you. I'd live in a tent if it meant being with you." His laugh was soft and wondering as he pulled her close. "No tents. You deserve better, but knowing you're willing, it changes things, makes everything more real, more urgent." "How soon can you secure the land?" she asked, practical even in this moment of emotion. "Within the month if the paperwork goes smoothly. Building would take longer, especially with winter coming. But by spring we could have something habitable." "Spring," she repeated thoughtfully. "A good time for new beginnings." Their engagement was announced formally the following Sunday at the Keller home, to the surprise of no one and the delight of everyone who knew them. George gave his blessing unreservedly, and even James and Daniel, protective of their sister as they were, acknowledged that no man could have proven his worth more thoroughly than Zachary had. The months that followed were filled with planning and preparation. Zachary secured the land, and with help from the Kellers and several hands from the Rockingham who volunteered their time, began construction on a modest but sturdy cabin before the first snow fell. Winter temporarily halted the building, but not the preparations. Beatrice sewed and quilted, collecting household items for their future home. Zachary continued working at the Rockingham, saving every penny and learning all he could from Thatcher about running his own operation. Their wedding was set for April 15, 1876, chosen to give them time to finish the cabin and prepare the land for their first cattle, which Zachary had arranged to purchase from his current employer at a fair price. As winter gave way to spring, anticipation grew. The cabin neared completion, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and proper windows ordered from back east that arrived on the same train that brought Beatrice's wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of ivory silk, with lace her mother had saved for this very purpose. On the morning of their wedding, Beatrice stood in her bedroom at the Keller homestead, fingering the two small scars on her calf that had changed the course of her life. "Ready, Bea?" her father asked from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. She turned to him, radiant in her wedding gown. "More than ready, Papa." The ceremony took place in Utica's small church, filled to capacity with well-wishers. Beatrice's students had decorated the altar with early spring wildflowers, and her father walked her down the aisle with pride shining in his eyes. But it was Zachary's expression, as she approached, that Beatrice would remember always, a look of such love and wonder that it seemed to illuminate him from within. The service was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary's kiss held both tenderness and promise. The celebration afterward at the Keller homestead lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. As the festivities continued, Zachary drew Beatrice aside for a moment of quiet. "Happy, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, still sounding slightly amazed at the title. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm rather looking forward to going home, our home." Their departure an hour later was marked by cheers, well wishes, and the traditional shower of rice. George embraced them both, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You two take care of each other," he said gruffly, "and don't be strangers. It's only 5 miles. "We'll be regular visitors," Beatrice promised, kissing his weathered cheek. "And you're always welcome at our place." The ride to their new home was peaceful, the spring evening mild with a full moon lighting their way. Zachary had insisted on carrying Beatrice across the threshold in proper tradition. And as he set her down in their small but comfortable cabin, the reality of their new life together finally seemed to sink in for both of them. "It's not much yet," he said apologetically, looking around at the simple furnishings, "but we'll add to it over time." "It's perfect," she insisted, turning in a slow circle to take it all in: the fireplace already lit and warming the room, the table he'd built himself, the bed in the adjoining room covered with her carefully stitched wedding quilt. "It's ours." Their first night as husband and wife was everything Beatrice had hoped for: tender, passionate, and filled with discoveries that left them both breathless. Zachary's gentleness and consideration touched her deeply, as did his obvious delight in her responses to his caresses. "I never imagined such happiness," he confessed as they lay together afterward, her head on his chest. "After my parents died, I thought I'd always be alone. Better that way, I told myself. And now?" she asked, raising herself on one elbow to look at him. His smile was answer enough, but he pulled her closer and whispered, "Now I can't imagine a single day without you." The weeks and months that followed were busy ones as they established their ranch and settled into married life. Zachary's careful planning paid off. Their first small herd of 30 cattle thrived on the lush spring grass, and he supplemented their income by breaking horses for neighboring ranchers, his skill with difficult mounts becoming well known in the area. Beatrice continued teaching, riding to Utica twice weekly while managing their household the rest of the time. She planted a vegetable garden, started a small flock of chickens, and even convinced Zachary that a milk cow would be a worthwhile investment. By their first anniversary, the Dawson Ranch had expanded to include a proper barn, a smokehouse, and the beginnings of what would eventually be a much larger herd. They celebrated quietly at home, exchanging small gifts: a hand-tooled leather journal from Zachary to Beatrice, and from her to him, the news that their family would be increasing in the fall. Zachary's reaction to the pregnancy announcement was everything Beatrice had hoped: joy, excitement, and a touch of awe as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the reality of the word. "Our baby. Are you pleased?" She asked, though his expression left little doubt. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," he replied, gathering her close. Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of those come closer. The months of Beatrice's pregnancy passed swiftly, filled with preparations and planning. Zachary built a cradle from pine harvested on their own land, and Beatrice sewed tiny garments in the evenings while he read aloud from books. They'd collected Dickens, Twain, and occasionally poetry that made her smile at his unexpected sentimentality. Their son, William George Dawson, arrived on a crisp October morning after a difficult but ultimately successful labor attended by both Doc Miller and a midwife from Utica. When Zachary first held his son, his hands trembling slightly with the preciousness of his burden, Beatrice thought her heart might burst with love for them both. "He has your eyes," she observed tiredly but happily from the bed. "And your determination," Zachary replied with a grin, noting the infant's strong grip on his finger. "He didn't make this easy on you." "The best things rarely come easily," she said, reaching for them both. Parenthood brought new challenges and deeper joys than either had anticipated. William Billy, as they called him, was a robust, curious baby who grew into a lively toddler with alarming speed. As their second anniversary approached, the Dawson Ranch continued to prosper. They'd added to their herd, improved their cabin with a proper addition that gave them a larger kitchen and a separate bedroom for Billy. And Zachary had even hired 2 hands to help with the expanding operation. Life wasn't without difficulties, of course. The winter of 1877-78 was particularly harsh, with blizzards that threatened their cattle and made even short journeys dangerous. There were minor injuries, occasional illnesses, and the constant challenges of frontier life. But through it all, Zachary and Beatrice faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Their love, which had begun so dramatically with a rattlesnake bite and a desperate rescue, deepened into something rich and enduring. On a summer evening in 1880, with their ranch now a respected and successful operation, and 4-year-old Billy helping to gather eggs from the chicken coop, Zachary found Beatrice standing in the doorway of their home, watching the sunset with a contented smile. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. She leaned back against him, covering his hands with her own. "About how different my life might have been if I hadn't gone flower picking that day, if a rattlesnake hadn't bitten me miles from town, if you hadn't found me." "Fate," he murmured against her hair. "Perhaps," she agreed, "or divine intervention. Either way, I'm grateful." "As am I," he said, turning her to face him. "Every day with you is a gift, Beatrice, even when you're being stubborn." He grinned at her mock indignant expression. "Says the most obstinate man in Montana Territory," she retorted, but her eyes were soft with affection. "I have news, by the way." Something in her tone made him study her face more carefully. "What kind of news?" Her smile widened. "Billy will have a brother or sister by winter's end." Joy spread across Zachary's features. "Really? You're certain?" "As certain as I was last time," she confirmed. "Doc Miller says everything looks perfectly normal." Zachary lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around until she laughingly protested. "Put me down, you ridiculous man. I'm not as light as I was when you carried me 5 miles, you know." "You're perfect," he countered, setting her gently on her feet but keeping her close. "And I could still carry you anywhere you needed to go." "I know you could," she said softly, serious now. "You've been carrying me in one way or another since the day we met. And you've been holding me up just as surely," he replied, equally earnest. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, was born on a snowy December evening in 1880. completing their family in a way that felt perfect to both Zachary and Beatrice. Billy was fascinated by his tiny sister, constantly wanting to help and proudly announcing to visitors that he was a big brother now. As the years passed, the Dawson Ranch continued to grow and prosper. By 1885, it had expanded to 300 acres with a herd of over 200 cattle. Their home had been enlarged again to accommodate their growing family, and Beatrice had finally gotten the piano she dreamed of, delivered all the way from St. Louis at considerable expense, but worth every penny for the music it brought into their lives. Billy, now 9, showed every sign of following in his father's footsteps with an innate understanding of animals and a natural seat on a horse. 5-year-old, Sarah was more like her mother, bookish and thoughtful, but with a streak of adventure that occasionally led her into scrapes. And in the spring of 1885, another addition surprised them: twins, Robert and Rachel, born easily despite Beatrice's initial concerns about carrying 2 babies at once. 4 children, Zachary marveled one evening as they sat on their expanded porch, watching Billy and Sarah play while the twins slept in their cradles nearby. If someone had told me 10 years ago that this would be my life, you wouldn't have believed them, Beatrice finished for him. Neither would I, but I wouldn't change a moment of it. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band he'd placed there 9 years earlier. Not even the rattlesnake, she laughed softly. Especially not the rattlesnake. It brought you to me after all. As the sun set over their land, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Zachary reflected on the strange twists of fate that had led him to this moment. A rattlesnake's bite, a desperate rescue, and a journey carrying a woman he didn't know toward a future he couldn't have imagined. "I love you, Beatrice Dawson," he said simply, the words as true now as they had been the first time he'd spoken them. "And I love you," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as their children's laughter filled the evening air. "Always." In the years that followed, the story of their meeting became family legend, retold at gatherings and celebrations, embellished slightly with each telling, until Zachary jokingly complained that in the latest version, he'd fought off the snake with his bare hands before carrying Beatrice 20 miles through a blizzard. But the core of the story remained unchanged and true: a chance encounter, a life saved, and a love that had built a family and a legacy on the Montana frontier. A love that had begun with danger and desperation, but had grown into something as enduring as the land itself, rooted deeply in mutual respect, shared dreams, and the daily choice to face life's challenges together. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the wildflowers bloomed in the meadows around their home, Beatrice would look at the 2 small scars on her leg and silently thank the rattlesnake that had changed her life forever.